She asked only for warmth for her children. The cowboy knew he could die for saying yes. The wind howled across the snow-covered plains, biting through even the thickest layers of clothing. Frost covered the wooden fences of the ranch, and the world seemed coated in white, stretching endlessly under a gray sky. The cowboy, a tall, strong man with weathered skin and hands hardened from years of work, trudged through the snow toward the barn. His boots sank slightly with each step, leaving deep impressions in the frozen ground. He had lived in this remote part of the country all his life. He knew the harshness of the winters, the loneliness of the plains, and the constant struggle against the cold and the storms. Yet, he did not complain. This life had shaped him, made him resilient, and taught him the value of hard work and self-reliance. The snow swirled around him, stinging his face and settling in his thick, dark hair. He tightened the collar of his coat and pushed open the barn door. The sound of creaking hinges loud in the otherwise silent morning. Inside, the smell of hay and animals was familiar and comforting. The cattle stirred as he approached, their warm breath steaming in the cold air of the barn. He checked on them quickly, feeding and watering what he could before the blizzard outside worsened. The wind was picking up speed, rattling the wooden structure, as though trying to warn him to stay inside. Just as he finished his work, a faint sound reached his ears, soft and almost drowned out by the storm. At first he thought it was the wind or the animals moving, but then he heard it again, a small, desperate cry, followed by a whimper. He froze, his instincts immediately alert. The plains were empty save for the ranch, the cattle, and the biting wind. Nothing should be out there. Yet, the sound persisted. He grabbed his thick coat and stepped outside, squinting through the snow. The storm made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. But then he spotted a small figure stumbling through the drifts. A little ahead and to the right. It was a woman, clutching two children tightly to her side. Their faces were pale, lips blue from the cold, and they looked on the verge of collapse. The cowboy's heart tightened at the sight. He had seen harsh winters before, but this was different. These were not just travelers or lost hunters. They were a mother and her children, completely unprepared for the storm. Their clothing was thin and torn, nothing that could protect them from the wind and freezing snow. Without thinking, he ran toward them, calling out, "Hey, come here!" "Hurry!" His voice cut through the howl of the wind, and the woman turned her face toward him, eyes wide with fear and hope. The children clung to her, shivering violently. When he reached them, the cowboy could feel the cold radiating from their bodies. "You can't stay out here," he said firmly, his voice gentle but urgent. "Come with me. You'll freeze to death." The woman hesitated, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to decide whether he could be trusted. There was something in her expression, desperation mixed with a quiet strength, that told him she had been through much already. She nodded slowly, finally accepting his help. The small boy, whose lips were purple, and helped the woman with the other. They stumbled together toward the safety of his cabin, each step a struggle through the deep snow. Inside the cabin, the warmth hit them like a wave. The cowboy quickly closed the door, shaking snow off his coat, and guided them toward the fire he had started earlier. He handed the children warm blankets, wrapping them carefully around their small bodies, and made sure they were seated near the hearth. The mother sank onto a chair, exhausted, her hands still trembling from the cold. She looked around, taking in the simple but sturdy cabin, the smell of wood smoke, and the safety it offered. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, yet filled with gratitude. I didn't know where else to go." The cowboy nodded, brushing his hands through his hair. He was used to solitude and silence, and having strangers in his home made him uneasy. But he knew there was no other choice. "You're safe here for now," he said simply. He turned to the children, checking them carefully for signs of frostbite. Their small hands were red and stiff, and their noses had begun to turn a light shade of purple. He knew he needed to act quickly. He fetched a pot of water, heating it over the fire, and helped the mother carefully wash their faces and hands. She watched him in silence, tears gathering in her eyes, overwhelmed by his kindness and calmness. As the storm raged outside, the cowboy moved back and forth between tasks, bringing in extra wood, tending the fire, and preparing a simple meal of soup and bread. Each movement was purposeful, his mind focused entirely on their safety and warmth. He could hear the wind slamming against the windows, the snow piling high outside. But inside, for the moment, there was a fragile peace. The children began to relax slightly, lulled by the warmth and the soft murmur of the fire. The little girl leaned against her mother, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, while the boy nuzzled the blanket, shivering but slowly calming down. Once the children were settled, the cowboy sat down across from the mother, observing her closely. She was young, perhaps only a few years older than he had been when he first took responsibility for his family. Her face was pale and lined with worry, but there was determination in her eyes. "You didn't have to help us," she said quietly, almost apologetically. "It's dangerous for you." The cowboy looked at her, and for the first time he allowed himself to acknowledge the risk he had taken. Helping them had put him in danger. He could have been caught in the storm. The fire could have gone out, or worse, someone might have been wandering the plains. But he had done it anyway. "I couldn't leave you out there," he said simply. "You had nowhere else to go." The mother nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. She reached out and took the cowboy's hand briefly, a gesture of gratitude that spoke volumes. The children, sensing the tension, curled closer to her, eyes wide but trusting. For a moment the cabin was quiet, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the occasional gust of wind outside. Yet, beneath the warmth, there was an undercurrent of unease. The plains were not forgiving, and the storm had not yet passed. The cowboy knew that even though they were safe for the night, there were still dangers lurking in the snow. The freezing cold, hidden ice, and the possibility of wild animals. As night fell, the wind grew stronger, rattling the windows and howling through the cracks in the cabin walls. The cowboy kept a careful watch, occasionally peeking outside, assessing the storm. The mother and children huddled together near the fire, their small bodies wrapped in layers of blankets. He could see the fear in their eyes, and it reminded him why he had chosen to help them. This was not just about warmth, it was about survival, about giving them a chance to live another day. He moved silently around the cabin, checking on the fire, making sure the blankets were secure, and ensuring there were no gaps where the cold could seep in. Hours passed slowly, each one marked by the relentless blizzard outside. The cowboy stayed awake, restless but vigilant. He kept a watchful eye on the door, listening for any unusual sounds, the snap of a branch, the howl of wolves, or any other sign of danger. He knew that one wrong step could be disastrous. But he also knew that the risk was worth it. The woman and children were asleep now, exhausted from the journey and the cold, and their breathing was steady. For the first time, the cowboy allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He had lived alone for many years, facing storms and hardships, but this night was different. He was no longer just protecting himself. He was responsible for the lives of others, and that responsibility weighed heavily on him. As he settled into a chair near the fire, the cowboy could feel the tension slowly easing, but he remained alert. The wind continued to rage outside, and the snow piled higher against the cabin walls. Yet inside there was warmth, safety, and a fragile sense of hope. He glanced at the mother, sleeping lightly, her hand resting protectively on the children. He knew the journey ahead would be difficult, but for now, they were alive, and that was enough. He allowed himself a small, tired smile, knowing that in the harshness of the winter, a single act of kindness could make all the difference. And somewhere in the distance, beneath the howling wind and swirling snow, he felt the faintest hint of something else, a sound, a crack of ice, or a movement in the shadows that reminded him the world outside was still dangerous, and the night was far from over. The morning light filtered weakly through the frost-covered windows of the cabin, casting a pale glow over the small, cramped space. Outside, the storm had eased slightly, but the wind still howled across the plains. The cowboy sat near the fire, his coat still damp from the night's work, and quietly observed the mother and her children. They were awake now, blinking sleep from their eyes, wrapped tightly in blankets that smelled faintly of wood smoke and hay. The little boy rubbed at his eyes, his tiny hands trembling from the cold that still lingered in his body, while the girl clung to her mother's side, her face pale but calm now that she was safe. The mother sat on the edge of her chair, brushing the snow from her coat, her eyes tired but grateful. She glanced at the cowboy, who was silently tending the fire, moving carefully to keep it burning steadily. "You didn't have to do this for us," she said softly, her voice shaky. "You could have just left us out there." Her words hung in the air, but the cowboy said nothing at first. He knew she didn't understand. This was his way, his life. He had grown up in this harsh land, and he knew the meaning of survival, the weight of responsibility, and the cost of showing mercy. Finally he spoke, his voice calm but firm.
"I couldn't leave you and the children outside. You would have frozen in minutes."
This land doesn't forgive mistakes like that. He met her gaze, his eyes steady and unwavering. "Right now, the only thing that matters is keeping you warm and safe until the storm passes." She nodded, a quiet relief washing over her face. She wrapped her arms tight around her children, glancing at them to make sure they were comfortable, though the blankets were far too thin to fully protect them from the lingering cold. The cowboy moved to the small stove in the corner of the cabin, fetching a pot of water and some dried meat and bread he had set aside for emergencies. He began heating the water and preparing a simple breakfast, moving with careful, practiced motions. His presence was quiet but commanding, and the family sensed the safety he provided. The mother watched him silently, her heart heavy with gratitude. She had fled a dangerous town with her children just a few days ago, escaping men who sought to harm them, and now she had found a stranger who offered warmth and protection. A part of her wanted to ask questions, to learn more about him, but the fear of the unknown still clung to her, and she remained silent, trusting him for now. As he stirred the pot, the cowboy kept an eye on the children. The little boy's hands were red and stiff, the skin cracked from exposure, and the girl's lips were still tinged with blue. He called them over, helping them wash their faces and hands with the warm water. They were hesitant at first, afraid of touching anything unfamiliar, but the warmth soothed them, and soon they leaned into his care, trusting his guidance. The mother assisted where she could, grateful for his quiet efficiency, and together they managed to get the children a little more comfortable. After breakfast, the cowboy knew he could not keep them inside indefinitely. The storm might have slowed, but the plains were still dangerous. Wolves prowled the edges of the snow fields, and patches of ice covered the ground, hidden beneath fresh drifts. Traveling through the snow with the children would be risky, but staying in the cabin was not safe either. He needed to make a plan. He knelt beside the mother, speaking softly so the children wouldn't hear. "I need to know exactly where you are headed," he said. "There's a town a few miles from here with shelter and warmth. We need to reach it, but we'll have to move carefully." She swallowed hard, nodding.
"Yes, that's where I was going."
I just wanted to survive until then. I never expected to find help here." Her voice trembled slightly, but there was a spark of hope in her eyes now. The cowboy stood, brushing the snow from his coat and picking up his sturdy walking stick. He looked outside, surveying the plains. The wind was still strong, but the visibility had improved slightly. The snow gleamed white under the pale sun, but it was treacherous. "We'll leave soon," he said. "But we must be careful. The children need to stay close, and we'll move slowly." He helped the woman and children gather their few belongings, old blankets wrapped around worn coats, and small bags of food. The children held on to their mother tightly, sensing the seriousness of the journey ahead. The cowboy led them to the door, pausing to glance back at the cabin. It was a simple structure, but it had provided shelter, warmth, and safety for one night. He silently vowed to continue protecting them, even as he stepped into the cold, white world beyond. The wind bit sharply at their faces as they emerged from the cabin. The snow crunched under their boots, deep in some places nearly up to the children's knees. The cowboy took the lead, moving slowly, his stick steadying him as he tested the ice-covered ground ahead. He glanced back frequently, making sure the mother and children were keeping up. Each step was careful, deliberate, as the snow shifted beneath them. The children stumbled occasionally, but the cowboy's strong hands were always there to steady them. Hours passed as they moved across the frozen plains. The mother stayed close to her children, whispering encouragement and stories to keep their spirits up. The cowboy's presence was constant, guiding them, breaking ice patches, and carrying supplies when necessary. The children's small faces began to show signs of fatigue, and the little boy's hands were still red from the cold. The cowboy stopped frequently, setting down blankets, letting the children rest, and feeding them small bites of the dried meat and bread they carried. During one pause, the cowboy noticed faint tracks in the snow nearby, tracks that did not belong to their group. Wolves, perhaps, or someone else braving the storm. His instincts told him to be cautious. He glanced at the mother, who noticed the tension in his expression. "Are we in danger?" she asked quietly, her voice edged with worry. He shook his head slightly, not wanting to alarm her. "Possibly," he said. "But we're doing the right thing by staying together and moving carefully. We'll watch each other's backs." She nodded, trusting him completely, though fear lingered in her eyes. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the light faded, casting long shadows over the snow. The wind picked up again, more persistent this time, and the snow began to drift once more, covering their tracks. The cowboy led them to a small outcrop of rocks, providing some shelter from the wind. He helped the mother settle the children, wrapping extra blankets around them and making sure they were as warm as possible. He built a small fire in a shallow pit, careful to keep it low to avoid being seen by anyone who might be nearby. The warmth was faint but enough to stave off the growing chill. That night, as they huddled together, the cowboy told the mother stories of his own childhood on the plains, of the harsh winters he had survived, and of the lessons he had learned about courage, resilience, and the importance of helping others. The children listened quietly, fascinated by the tales, and for a moment, the fear and cold melted away. They laughed softly at his small jokes, and the mother smiled, her eyes bright with hope and gratitude. But the cowboy could not relax. He knew the storm was not the only danger. The plains were vast and unpredictable, and winter travelers were rare but sometimes desperate. He kept watch through the night, scanning the darkness for movement, listening for sounds that might signal trouble. The mother and children slept, exhausted from the day's journey, their small bodies warm under the blankets he had provided. He stayed awake, thinking of every possible risk, every way the journey could go wrong. Hours later, the first hint of dawn appeared on the horizon, painting the snow in soft shades of pink and gold. The cowboy stirred, waking the family gently. "We need to keep moving," he said quietly. The mother nodded, her children still half asleep, but trusting him completely. They packed their belongings, the fire dying to embers behind them, and stepped out into the cold morning. The plains stretched endlessly ahead, but the cowboy led them with unwavering determination. The journey was slow, difficult, and exhausting, but the cowboy remained vigilant. He encouraged the children, guided the mother over icy patches, and kept an eye out for danger. As the day passed, they encountered small challenges: frozen streams to cross, steep hills covered in snow, and patches of ice hidden beneath fresh drifts. Each time the cowboy found a safe way forward, using his knowledge of the land and his own strength to protect the family. By late afternoon, they saw the faint outline of the town in the distance, a cluster of buildings offering the promise of warmth, safety, and human contact. The mother's eyes lit up with relief, and the children's small hands tightened around hers. The cowboy felt a sense of satisfaction, but he did not let his guard down. They were close, but the journey was not yet complete. The plains were still harsh, and the winter could change in an instant. As they neared the edge of the town, the cowboy paused and looked back across the snow-covered plains. For a brief moment, he reflected on the night they had spent together, the danger they had faced, and the fragile bond that had formed between them. He had chosen to help, even at great risk to himself, and now he had brought them within reach of safety. He felt a quiet pride, tempered by the knowledge that the world was still unpredictable, and the storm might return at any time. The plains stretched endlessly beneath the pale winter sky as the cowboy led the woman and her children toward the town. The snow had softened since the storm, but the cold still bit sharply at their faces and hands. Every step was slow and careful. The little boy's small legs struggled through the drifts, and the girl clutched her mother's coat tightly. The cowboy stayed close, guiding them, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. He had survived many storms and winters, but he had never felt responsibility like this before. These were not just strangers. These were lives in his hands, and he could not afford a single mistake. For a while the journey was quiet. The wind whispered through the frozen grass and the snow crunched under their boots. The mother whispered gentle encouragements to her children, telling them stories to keep their minds off the cold. The cowboy listened silently, walking at a steady pace, his coat dusted with snow, his eyes sharp. Despite the exhaustion that pulled at his muscles, he did not slow. He could not. The land could be unforgiving, and he knew that danger could come from anywhere. Hidden patches of ice, sudden drops, or even someone else on the plains. By midday they had crossed the first shallow river, its surface frozen and slippery. The cowboy tested each step, sliding carefully across, holding out his hand for the mother and children to follow. The little boy stumbled, and the cowboy caught him just in time. "Be careful, little one," he said softly. "The ice is strong, but we must respect it." The mother nodded, holding the girl closer, her eyes wide with trust and fear. Every step forward was a small victory. They moved slowly, methodically, each step deliberate, each moment focused on survival. Suddenly the cowboy froze. He crouched low and motioned for the others to stop. There were tracks in the snow, fresh footprints, large and heavy, approaching from the side of the path. He studied them quickly. Wolves? Perhaps. Or someone worse. His heart beat faster, but he did not panic. He motioned for the mother and children to stay behind a small hill, crouching low. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Do not move. Do not make a sound." The strangers, or animals, moved closer. Shadows danced across the snow, long and dark in the pale light. The cowboy's hands rested on his walking stick, ready to defend. His mind raced, calculating every possibility, every risk. He could hear the mother's shallow breathing behind him and the soft, nervous whimpers of the children. He focused on keeping them safe, even if it meant putting himself in danger. A group of men appeared, their faces hidden by scarves and hats, their movements slow and deliberate. They looked desperate, perhaps even dangerous. The cowboy knew that they could not allow these men near the family. "Stay back!" he called firmly, stepping forward. The men hesitated, sizing him up. One of them moved closer, voice rough. "We just need some food. We don't mean trouble." The cowboy shook his head. "You leave. Now, there's nothing for you here." The tension in the air was thick. The wind swirled around them, carrying snow and uncertainty. The cowboy's mind raced, weighing his options. He could not let these men near the woman and children. They had already suffered enough. Yet, he wanted to avoid a fight, if possible. His eyes locked on the leader of the group, gauging their intentions. Finally, he said again, firmer this time, "I said leave. You do not come near them. Understand?" The men exchanged glances, muttering among themselves. Their desperation was clear, but so was their unwillingness to back down. One of them stepped closer, raising a hand. The cowboy tightened his grip on his stick. He did not want to hurt anyone, but he would not allow harm to come to the family. The mother clutched the children, her eyes wide with fear. The cowboy's stance was solid, unwavering, a silent promise that no one would pass him. The standoff lasted tense minutes. Snow blew around them, swirling like a white curtain. The men seemed to decide against confrontation for now. They muttered threats under their breath, their words lost in the wind, and slowly retreated back across the snowfields. The cowboy did not relax immediately. He watched until the figures disappeared completely, melting into the white expanse of the plains. Only then did he turn back to the family, his face calm but serious. "It's over for now," he said, "but we cannot stop moving. We must reach the town before nightfall." The mother exhaled, relief flooding her features, and hugged her children tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, voice trembling. The cowboy nodded but did not speak. Gratitude was not necessary. safety was. Every moment spent lingering in one place increased risk. They continued forward, each step deliberate, the children following closely, the mother steadying them as best she could. The journey was exhausting, but they were alive, and that was all that mattered. By afternoon, the town's outline grew clearer on the horizon, a cluster of buildings and rooftops rising above the snow, faint plumes of smoke curling from chimneys. The cowboy allowed a small moment of hope, but he did not relax his vigilance. Even here, the plains could be dangerous. Wolves still prowled, and desperate people might take risks to survive. He led the family through the outskirts carefully, choosing paths that offered cover and safety. They reached the edge of the town just as the sun began to sink behind the distant hills. Shadows stretched long across the snow, and the wind bit sharply at their faces. The cowboy slowed, letting the mother and children catch their breath. "We're close," he said quietly. "Just a little further, and you'll find help and warmth." The mother's eyes glistened with tears, the children clinging to her side. They had endured the storm, the snow, the cold, and the threat of strangers. Now, finally, there was a chance for safety. As they stepped into the town, the cowboy noticed people peering out of windows, curious about the small family moving cautiously through the snow. Shops were closing, the streets quiet, but there were still signs of life. He led them to a small inn, a simple building with a warm glow from the windows. The sign above the door read, "The Winter Hearth Inn." He knocked firmly, and a kind-faced innkeeper opened the door, startled by the sight of the three travelers. The cowboy explained the situation briefly, his voice steady. "They've been caught in the storm. The children are cold and tired. They need shelter for the night." The innkeeper's eyes softened immediately, and he gestured for them to enter. The warmth hit them instantly, melting the last of the cold from their bodies. Blankets, hot drinks, and a warm fire awaited them inside. The children's eyes widened, and the mother exhaled deeply, relief flooding her features. As they settled in, the cowboy stepped aside, watching them quietly. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. They were safe. The children's cheeks were pink with warmth, their hands no longer stiff and red. The mother's gratitude was quiet but deep, reflected in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. The cowboy shook his head. "Just stay safe. That's all the thanks I need." Yet even as he spoke, he could feel the weight of what had passed. The storm, the plains, the dangerous men. They were all behind them, but the memory of the danger lingered. He had risked his own safety, moved through a blizzard, and confronted strangers, all to protect a family he had never met before. But as he looked at the mother and children, now safe and warm, he knew it had been worth it. Every step, every risk, every moment of fear had led to this. They were alive. That was enough. The innkeeper offered them a small room, and the mother tucked her children into the beds, holding them close. The cowboy lingered by the fire, watching them. He felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of pride he rarely allowed himself. He had faced danger, had protected the innocent, and had guided them to safety. It was not fame or recognition he sought, just the quiet knowledge that he had done what was right. Night fell over the town, and the wind outside howled gently, no longer a threat but a reminder of the harsh world beyond. The cowboy stood by the window looking out at the snow-covered plains, reflecting on the day's journey. The mother and children slept soundly, the warmth of the inn surrounding them. For the first time he allowed himself a small smile. They were safe, alive, and protected. And in the quiet of the winter night he realized that courage and selflessness could light even the coldest, darkest places. Even as the storm had passed, he knew that life on the plains would always carry risk. But he had proven that a single person willing to act with bravery and heart could make all the difference. The family would remember this night, the warmth of the fire, the safety of the inn, and the steadfast presence of the cowboy who had risked everything for them. Morning came slowly in a small town, the pale light spilling across the rooftops and melting some of the snow from the streets. Inside the inn, the mother stirred, her children still wrapped in blankets, eyes heavy with sleep. For the first time in days, she felt safe. The warmth of the fire had restored some of the color to their faces, and the small room offered comfort she had not known in weeks. Yet, she could not forget the man who had saved them, the cowboy who had led them through the storm and defended them when danger threatened. The cowboy sat quietly near the window, watching the snow fall softly outside, his hands resting on his walking stick. He had stayed through the night not because he was obligated, but because he could not leave them alone in a world so harsh. Though he had faced many challenges on the plains, nothing had moved him like this. Protecting a mother and her children who had nowhere else to go. He had risked himself, and yet there was no thought of reward or recognition in his heart. The warmth of their safety was enough. After a simple breakfast, the mother approached him, her children clinging to her coat. "We should go," she said softly. "The town can help us now. They can provide food, warmth, and work. But I don't know how we could ever repay you." The cowboy shook his head, a faint smile on his lips. "Just survive. Take care of your children. That is all the thanks I need." She nodded, tears forming in her eyes. She had expected help to be temporary, perhaps reluctant, yet this man had risked everything for them. The cowboy helped them gather their belongings, old blankets and small bags packed carefully. The children were excited now, a little lighter in spirit, though their bodies were still weak from the cold. The mother's hands were steady as she held them close, her eyes reflecting gratitude and awe. Together, they left the inn, stepping into the crisp morning air. The snow crunched beneath their boots, but it felt lighter now. The storm had passed, the world seemed calmer, and there was hope in the town ahead. As they walked, the cowboy led them along the safest paths, avoiding patches of ice and hidden snowdrifts. Though danger had diminished, he remained vigilant. The mother noticed his careful watchfulness and could not help but speak. "You are always looking," she said softly. "Even now you did not relax." The cowboy glanced at her, his eyes steady. "It's my habit. I've lived long enough to know danger never disappears completely. But you are safe, and that matters most." They passed the outskirts of the town, where small shops and homes showed signs of life. People peered from windows or waved cautiously, noticing the unusual trio. The children waved back timidly, their trust in the cowboy giving them courage. The mother felt a rush of relief. She had feared the unknown, the danger of strangers, but this town seemed kind, a place where they could finally rest. The cowboy led them to the center of town, where an innkeeper had promised to help, and several townsfolk gathered to assist, offering blankets, food, and kind words. The mother knelt to her children, tears in her eyes. "We are safe now," she whispered. The little boy and girl looked up at her, their eyes wide but trusting, and hugged her tightly. She looked up at the cowboy, who had stayed slightly apart, quiet but strong, observing their reunion. "Thank you," she said again, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. "You risked your life for us." The cowboy's face was calm, almost solemn. "I did what anyone should have done. You had nowhere else to go. That was enough for me." The townspeople offered food and warmth, and the family settled into a small room. The children's cheeks were flushed from the warmth, their hands finally free from the red, stiff marks of the cold. The mother's eyes were bright with relief, but she could not shake the memory of the cowboy, his steady presence, and the courage he had shown. She knew she would never forget him, nor the night he had risked everything for her family. Hours passed, and the mother spoke with the innkeeper about work and shelter, preparing for a future where her children would not suffer the same hardships again. The cowboy watched quietly, feeling a sense of completion. His role was not to stay, not to become part of their lives forever, but to guide them through danger and make sure they reached safety. In the quiet of the town, he realized that true heroism was not in recognition or praise, but in the knowledge that lives had been saved. Before leaving, he knelt briefly beside the children, who were now more lively and curious. "Be brave," he said softly. "Stay together. Take care of each other." The little girl nodded, gripping his hand tightly, and the boy tried to mimic her, his small fingers closing around the cowboy's. They did not fully understand what he had risked, but they felt safe in his presence. The mother placed a hand on his shoulder, a silent gesture of respect and gratitude. He nodded in return, understanding that the bond forged in adversity was quiet but unbreakable. Outside the town, the cowboy paused, glancing back at the small family now settled and protected. The snow lay soft and white around him, the wind gentle compared to the storm they had survived. He could feel the cold seep through his coat, but it mattered little. The warmth of knowing the family was safe filled him more than any fire ever could. He breathed deeply, the crisp air filling his lungs, and began the slow walk back toward his ranch. The plains stretched endlessly, harsh and unyielding, but he felt a quiet pride in his heart. As he walked, he thought about the lessons of the storm, of courage and selflessness. He had chosen to act when others might have hesitated. He had faced danger not for recognition but because it was the right thing to do. The memory of the family's fear, the relief, and the children's small smiles stayed with him, a reminder of why he lived the life he did, why he respected the land, and why he valued every human life he encountered. The wind whispered across the plains, carrying with it the faint smell of wood smoke and pine from the town, a reminder of warmth, safety, and the small comforts that often went unnoticed. The cowboy's steps were steady, each one a quiet testament to endurance and courage. He did not need applause, nor would he expect it. The knowledge that he had given the family a chance at survival was reward enough. He could picture them in the town, safe, warm, and beginning to rebuild their lives. That vision was all he needed to feel a deep sense of peace. By evening, he reached his own cabin, the familiar wooden structure standing strong against the fading winter light. Snow had drifted against the walls, and the wind still blew cold, but inside, the fire waited him. He removed his coat, shaking off the snow, and settled near the hearth, feeling the warmth seep through his tired body. His hands were sore from the journey, his muscles stiff, but his mind was clear. The storm had passed, and he had done what he could to protect those in need. As night fell over the plains, the cowboy sat quietly, reflecting on the events of the past days. He thought of the mother's grateful eyes, the children's small hands, and the courage it had taken for all of them to endure the storm. He realized that true strength was not measured by survival alone, but by the willingness to face danger for the sake of others. He felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that his actions had made a difference, and that even in a harsh and unforgiving land, kindness and courage could shine brightly. The wind howled softly outside, but it no longer carried the same threat. It was merely a reminder of the wild, beautiful land he called home. He glanced out the window, the snow glinting in the moonlight, and allowed himself a faint smile. He knew the family was safe, their lives forever changed by his courage and care. He had faced the storm, protected the innocent, and guided them to safety. In the quiet of his cabin, the cowboy felt a sense of peace he rarely allowed himself, a deep understanding that bravery, compassion, and selflessness could light even the darkest, coldest nights. And as the fire crackled, warming his hands in the small room around him, he realized that the plains would always be harsh, the winters long, and the dangers many. But in the quiet acts of courage, in the small moments of kindness, life endured. The mother and children would remember him, not for his strength alone, but for the warmth and safety he had provided when the world seemed cruel and unyielding. And the cowboy, sitting alone in his cabin, knew that he had truly done what he was meant to do: protect, endure, and give hope to those who had none.